Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on education policy for students with disabilities. My name is Katie Neese, and I'm Senior Vice President at Easter Seals. This webinar is the first of 3 that will be held this fall. The goal of these webinars is to give parents and disability advocates an overview and update of what's going on in federal policy. Today's webinar will provide information about how the policies and rights of Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act interact for students with disabilities. In our series will be November 20th, and there will address assessments. The webinar will be December 11th, and then we'll address graduation. Webinars will be at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. They will be recorded and available at the website higherexpectationsforall.org. Before we get started, we have some housekeeping issues. This will last about 90 minutes. We've scheduled half of the webinar for your questions. So until that time, your lines will be on mute. And we really look forward to getting your questions. I also want to recognize the 9 organizations who are, hold on one sec. I've already screwed up. So here are the dates for the next ones. And here are the 9 organizations that have made this webinar possible. The Collaboration to Promote Self-Determination, the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, Easter Seals, the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities, the National Center for Learning Disabilities, the National Disability Rights Network, and Advocacy Institute. I'll hear from 3 really dynamic speakers today. I'd like to introduce them now. Ron Yeager is Senior Staff Attorney for the National Disability Rights Network, and he'll start off the presentation talking about IDEA. Ron provides training and technical assistance to the Protection and Advocacy Network on Special Education. He specialized in disability law, particularly in education, since 1979, when he started his legal career in Buffalo as a VISTA attorney. As a clinical professor at the State University of New York at Buffalo Law School, Ron supervised the Educational Law Clinic. He moved to Neighborhood Legal Services, where he represented clients in a variety of disability-related cases and was a frequent author on disability law-related issues. He was chair of the New York State Bar Association's Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities and was president of the Board of Directors of Autistic Services, Inc. in Western New York. Ron earned a BA in psychology from the State University of New York at Binghamton and a law degree from the State University of New York at Buffalo Law School. Ron is an optimistic and tenacious warrior for justice for kids with disabilities, and I know you're going to enjoy his presentation. Ron will be followed by Laura Killoy. Laura is an advocate for individuals with disabilities and is on to a teenage son who has embraced his dyslexia and dysgraphia. Her pain and advocacy experience spans a range of issues, including early intervention, education, health and employment, with expertise in at-risk youth, literacy, assessment, special education, and civil rights. Consults with national nonprofits to guide successful legislative advocacy and public affairs campaigns in Washington, D.C. and throughout the United States. Laura is the best national advocate for students with disabilities. She is so respected because of her basic smarts, depth of her knowledge of really complicated issues, and her unwavering commitment to all children. Our final speaker is Marcy Lipset. Marcy lives in Michigan with her husband, son, and 3 dogs. For the 25 years, she's been the mother to her greatest inspiration and hero, her son Andrew, who has multiple disabilities. Currently, Marcy is the founder and co-chair of the Michigan Alliance for Special Education, a grassroots advocacy organization. Successfully lobbied for an extended school year rule in the Michigan Special Education Administrative Rules. Her efforts have been instrumental in forcing Michigan to raise the standards required for secondary special education teachers. In 2010, Marcy was instrumental in stopping the Michigan Department of Education from being a cross-categorical teacher to the state special education rules. In 2011, Marcy attended the first William and Mary Law School Institute for Special Education Advocacy. In October 2013, became one of the first to graduate from the inaugural Council of Parent Attorney and Advocates Special Education Advocacy Training Program, as a nationally recognized as an advocate with advanced training. Dean Eastwood Easter Seals and will be moderator for today's webinar. I've been at Easter Seals doing policy work on behalf of children with disabilities for almost 20 years. This time I've served as one of the co-chairs of the Education Task Force of the National Disability Coalition, the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. In addition, I'm chair of the board of CCD. Prior to Easter Seals, I was Associate Director of the American Association of University-Affiliated Programs for Persons with Developmental Disabilities, and I had the great fortune of being legislative staff to Senator Tom Harkin during his tenure as chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy. So to get things rolling, here's a quick overview of today's webinar. As you all know, IDEA, IDEA guarantees every child with a disability the right to a free, appropriate public education, regardless of the nature or severity of the child's disability. IDEA originated in 1975. When it revised the law in 1997, several important provisions were added to this landmark civil rights law. Students with disabilities were to have access to the general curriculum. IDEA was first enacted in 1975. There was the thought that kids with disabilities have the right to physically attend public school. In 1997, that right was clarified to mean that not only should students with disabilities have the ability to physically enter their school, but that these students should be taught in the same manner as their non-disabled peers. So Congress required students with disabilities to be included in state and district-wide assessments with appropriate accommodations when necessary. For students who cannot take the regular assessment, their progress was to be measured based on an alternate assessment. The purpose of these provisions was to raise expectations about the academic achievement of students with disabilities. Our policy was that students with disabilities should do more than simply attend school. They should be expected to make academic progress that is similar to their non-disabled peers. For too long, children with disabilities were told what they cannot do. These policies focus on what they can achieve and gives them the opportunity to try. Now turn the program over to Ron Hager.
Thank you much, Katie. And as oh, it is, I can now advance the ball. I really appreciate that introduction because Katie gave a little bit of an overview of much of what I'm going to be focusing on. Anyway, as Katie said, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was first passed in 1975, which means next year we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of passage of that law. It's hard to believe that it's been there for so long. And I'm going to give you a couple of the key acronyms and concepts before we get into the more detail of our session this afternoon. There's several key points. The first is that all students with disabilities are guaranteed a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restricted environment, RE, pursue a written, individualized education program, or IEP. And parents have the right to due process. They question school district decisions. Although there's been a number of amendments to IDEA over the years, as Katie talked about, one significant one, increasing access to the curriculum, the main provisions have stayed the same. The basic protections have stayed the same. And so school districts may say, well, we've had these changes over the years, not that much. So we really hope in this day and age that the school districts are being able to implement the requirements of IDEA. There's a very law, which we're really not going to talk about today. I thought I'd at least throw it out there for you, called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This law actually predated IDEA, but IDEA has provided the primary protections for students with disabilities that qualify for services under IDEA. 504 applies to any program or activity receiving federal funds, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. It, too, has an obligation to provide FAPE in the least restrictive environment, and it, too, has a process for parents to challenge school district recommendations that they may disagree with. The other thing about 504 is, like IDEA, which we're going to be getting to in just a second, 504 also has a provision that the 504 team would consider any testing accommodations that a student with disability might need. So Section 504, in many ways, parallels, but we're going to be focusing today on IDEA. He alluded to the kind of the purposes for IDEA have been enhanced. I think in 1997, the purpose is to ensure that all children with disabilities have a free, appropriate public education that's designed to meet their unique individual needs. And that's a huge issue, that too often we see the problems in school districts implementing IDEA where they're really not individualizing for the individual student needs. So that's the first key piece, is that the students' program should be based on their individual unique needs. In addition, why are we educating these children, students as they get older, to prepare them for education, employment, and independent living? We want students with disabilities to be prepared to meet the demands of adult life. Two IDEA purposes was that students with disabilities should be able to meet the challenging expectations that have been established for all children and improve academic achievement and functional performance to the maximum extent possible. As Katie said, we want to have high expectations for students, including students with disabilities. She also said one of the key changes from 97 was ensuring not just that they're in the schoolhouse door, but that students with disability have access to the general curriculum. And the statutory provision specifically says that education of children with disabilities can be more effective by having high expectations and ensuring access to the general educational curriculum, regular education in classroom, to the maximum extent possible. And we see a number of different places where IDEA has implemented that. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on these, but kind of go through them relatively quickly. But you have the slides to give you more information about the details. So even when we look at what is the definition of special education, we see it include the data content, methodology, or delivery of instruction, which is, again, designed to meet the unique needs of the child and to ensure that that student has access to the general curriculum so that child can meet the educational standards that apply to all children. That's the purpose of IDEA, to ensure that students with disabilities can meet the same expectations as every other student to the minimum extent possible. We see this concept of access to the general curriculum play out in the IEP. First is, in terms of present levels of performance, that the access, one of the issues that we're addressing in present level of performance is access to the general curriculum. We see IEP goals, that the goals are to be designed to ensure access to the general curriculum, and that is actually one of the primary considerations in developing child's goals. And last, services that are to be provided. The services are to be designed to enable the child to be involved in and progress in the general educational curriculum. One of the things about this is, when we look at what is the general curriculum, well, states move to implement Common Core standards. That is going to be the general curriculum. That's the benchmark. Are they accessing the entire curriculum, and are they making progress in that curriculum? For states that do not implement Common Core, they still have curricular standards. And as you're looking at an individual child, compare the child's progress with requirements of the general curriculum, and where they're falling short or where they need supportive services or interventions, that's where the emphasis needs to be. So how are we going to measure success in accessing that general curriculum? Both the Individuals with Disabilities Act and the Secondary Education Act, Elementary Secondary Education Act have expectations. Laura's going to talk in more depth about the requirements of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, but I just want to kind of touch on it here for a little bit. As you may know, in 2001, they had the ESEA and actually changed the name to call it the No Child Left Behind Act. And the intent here was similar to what we talked about with IDEA. All children learn, all children are expected to achieve at a high academic content standard, and to reflect whether the students are making adequate progress, they test it. And school districts will be held accountable for the success of their students, not just based on, just for students that do not have disabilities, but for students who do have disabilities as well. And so IDEA has basically taken these NCLB requirements and add them into IDEA. Now, one of the things that's a little different, though, is that the addition of assessments under IDEA doesn't just apply to the NCLB-based assessments, but any other high-stakes tests that school districts might be given. Every single school or district-wide assessment will be required to comply with these requirements I'm going to be talking about in a minute, just following up. And any determination about what assessment the student would take and any accommodations the student would be receiving are to be made by that IEP team. The IEP team is the core driver of this process, and the parents are a member of that IEP team. For NCLB, there's 4 basic types of assessments. The first assessment option is the same assessment as everyone else, nothing changed. The next would be a regular assessment with accommodations. The third is an alternate assessment based on the same academic content standards as the regular assessment, but a different measure of demonstrating proficiency, what we could call, for example, a portfolio assessment. And then the last one is a modified assessment based on different or modified educational standards. Again, the team determines which of the assessments the student will take and indicates if it's an alternative assessment, the reasons why, and also, again, any accommodations the student might require. And, in looking at IDEA requirements, the first step is that school districts, statewide core assessments should be done on principles of universal design, meaning that for the most part we shouldn't be needing to adapt, the assessments that are being given. The other piece of this is that if the alternative assessment, that last option, is not aligned to Common Core standards or general academic standards, the IEP team needs to be aware of the implications of that, including whether or not the assessment will, or the content standard will qualify the student for a diploma. We'll be talking about that during the last of our sessions. And additionally, this was added in 2007. The state cannot identify an accommodation that, quote unquote, invalidates the score. This is a real problem. So the IEP team can only select accommodations that will not invalidate the test. What does that mean? That when the test is created, it's to measure a certain academic skill, and if there's an accommodation the student needs, that is, will that accommodation, quote unquote, invalidate the test? And this has come up with the Common Core assessment groups. They're the ones that create the test, so they're the ones that should first bite at the apple, if you will, in determining what accommodations may or may not affect the test validity. Now, here's the problem. Many students with disabilities are very successful, very able to access the general curriculum and progress in the general curriculum with certain accommodations. And the question might be, well, that accommodation really is not going to be allowed on our test because it invalidates the test. And, what I say there is, if it's a regular assessment under NCLB or ESEA, where you're looking at the school district, is the school ensuring that students are making progress in ensuring success for their students, it's not really as critical an issue. But if it's another type of test, a test that the student may be required to use to graduate or to go on to the next grade, what we call a high stakes test, the failure of that accommodation can be a huge barrier to that student moving on from the next grade. And you can't get your school district to pull off the dime and accept the accommodations that the student needs. An option could be that option that we talked about at the very beginning, where the student would take the same academic content standard using a different way of demonstrating proficiency. This is potentially going to be an advocacy strategy that's going to be needed for students where you can't get the accommodation that they need. All right, over to Katie. But I'm going to pass the ball. Someone else is going to have to pass the ball. Logically incapable.
Hi, pleased to be here today. This is Laura Kaloy, and we're going to spend some time talking about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, and the connection to students with disabilities. And in my role at Washington Partners, I get to do something really wonderful, which is to work directly with the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates as their government affairs representative. And I just wanted to mention that partnership has allowed us to work directly with the partners in this series of webinars, and I just think it's fantastic that we can offer this to advocates and parents and others who want to learn more about how the laws work and to understand what the climate is like here in Washington, D.C. for students with disabilities in this policy discussion. So let's get going. We're just going to talk about the essentials of the law, and we're going to touch on how the waivers, many states have waivers under ESEA currently, and we want to be able to discuss and share with you some of the highlights of what that looks like, the impact on students with disabilities, some of the opportunities and challenges that we see moving forward related to federal education law. So ESEA really has one major title. It has three, and others programs are authorized under ESEA, but the one we're going to focus our time on today is Title I. And so ESEA was passed in 1965. President Johnson, this was one of the centerpieces to his call to end poverty, and it followed when President Kennedy at the time and Vice President Johnson were involved in initiatives to expand what they called the Great Society programs. And of course, Sputnik had occurred, and there was a big rush and a big call for more scientists and engineers. And it's just interesting that we're still having that same discussion that, science and technology continue to be a landmark need in this country. And so the law was passed in 1965, and several other major laws passed in that next several-year time frame: the Higher Education Act, the Civil Rights Act, and of course the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1975. 1965 has been updated. Now, most authorized laws are required to be reauthorized by Congress about every 5 years. And I'm not going to take you through all of those, but the bottom line is President Clinton did in this law in 1994 and changed the name to Improving America's Schools Act, and really expanded the federal role and what it could like, and kind of laid the groundwork for what came later in 2001 with No Child Left Behind, and then it was signed in 2002 by President Bush. And when that law was passed, I don't know if you recall, but it was a great partnership between Kennedy, Chairman John Boehner, who was chairman of the Kennedy, and the Republicans and the Democrats came together in great agreement that more needed to be done to really take a look at how students were doing in reading and math. So, get students in high poverty. I've just put a little bit of data in here. It does reach 90% of our schools across the country, and it impacts about 12.5 million public and private school-age students. The monies flow pretty much to grades 1 through 6, and there's some money that goes to the younger grades, and very little goes to the high schools. So just know this really is focused on the 6, grades 1 to 6 age range, and ensure that all children have equal opportunity to obtain a high-quality education and reach proficiency on state standards. That's straight out of the statute. So here are the major requirements that we're going to touch on today to show what the linchpin connections are to IDEA. And so the essentials are, fundamentally, it requires that each state, these aren't set by the feds, but each state is required to set math and reading standards, set performance targets and goals in reading and math, that they must also set graduation targets, and there must be extra weight placed on students graduating in 4 years with an opportunity to get credit at the school and district level for students taking longer than 4 years. There's a full regulation that was written and finalized in 2008 on calculation and reporting of graduation. We're not going to talk about that today. That will come up in one of the later webinars. They are required to give annual assessments, grades 3 through 8, and once in high school for 95% of all students in each subgroup. And the subgroups are students who live in poverty, who have a minority background, disabilities, and English language learners. So those are the subgroups and how the data is disaggregated at the school building, at the district, and at the state level. And under the original law, they were meant to offer specific interventions and close schools for certain low-performing schools. And a subgroup who was struggling in every school was meant to get targeted intervention. And so it was an extensive mandate to try and improve the overall achievement for every attending public school. It'd be helpful to get an idea of the funding that's attached to Title I and what the qualified uses are for these funds. And then I put the data here for IDEA as well, so you can see how the federal funds flow to states from these two major laws. Allowed uses of Title I funds are to hire additional staff for the purchase of instructional materials and then provide professional development through what's called Title II and through Title I. It's really meant to focus on reading and math in school buildings where students struggle. And you can there are several formulas. We're not going to go into that today. There's a lot to read on Title I, but the bottom line is an entire school can be a Title I school, or there can be money flowing to your school for your Title I population that's in your school, but if you don't have sufficient number of students who are qualified for free and reduced lunch, your whole school doesn't qualify as a Title I school. So the Act on students with disabilities with this law touched on a couple of these things, so I won't go into great detail, but it's the impact is there was a major shift in the focus from certain students can achieve, these Title I students, to a student needs to be achieving on grade level standards in every school building. And this was a major shift to have the No Child Left Behind law focus on every student. And Kay's, who's our moderator today, was actually involved in the negotiation of these changes and tell quite a story about how it became apparent as the negotiations were occurring that they hadn't quite thought through how this was going to impact students with disabilities, but they realized they couldn't leave them out. And it's very important for us to understand and acknowledge that this policy shift really was a game changer for not only the students but for our families and for us as parents to be able to have access to new data. It had been a requirement in 1997 to assess students with disabilities. Most states had dragged their heels and hadn't done anything about that requirement. And so it took this stick of the money coming through Title I under No Child Left Behind for states to have to develop assessments and alternate assessments for students with significant cognitive disabilities, that they could include students with disabilities in their annual assessments and then, of course, need to report on the achievement of those students in their data for district and state accountability purposes. So the shift here was monumental. And finally had annual test data. Even at the end of the year, there are some challenges with that, and we'll talk about that in the next webinar, I think. But the most important thing here is that students were included and had to count, and something had to be done if they weren't making progress as a group. And so this was new. A couple of things that came forward is that teacher certification in core subjects says reading and math actually count as well, and that students needed to be taught by teachers who are qualified and certified in the state to be teaching those core subjects. And it was a shift for students with disabilities. Previous to that, it wasn't necessarily a requirement that if you were being taught reading in a special ed setting, that your reading teacher actually was certified to teach reading. And so this was another shift. So, as I said, every law is meant to be reauthorized or discussed by the Congress about every 5 years. And so technically, No Left Behind, or EA, was supposed to be reauthorized in 2007. And because of the challenges that we've had in Washington, D.C. with the shifts in who's in charge on Capitol Hill or who's in charge in the White House, there hasn't been agreement on how to reauthorize this law. And so it's now 2014. And when President Obama and his administration came in 2008, the decision, because Congress hadn't reauthorized the law, that they would issue waivers under ESA. And they've issued 43 states have waivers, including the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And what they've done is they've given flexibility of key provisions under No Child Left Behind in exchange for states to agree to do other things. The major exchange here is that states were no longer required to have every subgroup of students in every school make adequate yearly progress against those performance targets that I mentioned. And they were required to give intervention to every subgroup of students in every school who weren't making progress. They also were able to they didn't have to submit these annual teacher improvement plans that they were submitting prior to this time. And what they agreed to be able to qualify for the waiver, they agreed to develop teacher evaluation systems, to adopt college and career-ready standards that are approved by their state higher education system, and states have adopted the Common Core state standards as their college and career-ready standards. We're going to talk about the Common Core in a minute, but the choice, because it was very apparent, as if one of the downsides of No Child Left Behind is some states had set their standards so low and set their proficiency rates so low that students were graduating from high school and were not prepared to go to the colleges and universities within their own states. Students couldn't qualify on the exam to go into the military. And governors and others came together and decided, this was a problem. And so that all was happening kind of as a backdrop to what the administration wanted to do with these waivers. And so they college and career-ready standards, and they wanted to have a more rigorous standard. What does the university system in the state want to see a graduating student coming out of high school be able to know and do if they're going to be able to come into the college setting? So these waivers have been approved, and as things have evolved here, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. There's been waivers on the waivers. The evaluation system is a good example. Most states have not finalized these teacher evaluation systems. I'm sure wherever you live, there might be some discussion happening around this. The unions aren't happy with tying teacher performance to the proficiency and the outcomes of students, and that becomes it's become a driving issue, and it's a modern debate now on what to do about America's public system. How do we ensure teachers can teach, and what does an evaluation system look like that would be fair, but be able to connect to the student learning that is to occur. So it's an ongoing discussion. So they've waived the time in which teacher evaluation systems had to be approved. They also said that you don't have to meet the rigor of the requirements under what's called equitable distribution of teachers in high poverty schools. And as you can imagine, for people living in poverty-stricken communities, this hasn't been good news, because we already know schools are challenged to provide quality teachers, including for special education students in some of our more high poverty areas. But it is one of the gives that the department has allowed to waive. And the other thing that they did this spring is they allowed states who were using the Common Core coming forward out of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortia and PARC. Your state may be involved in either one of those Common Core assessment systems or developing their own. But if you're part of Smarter Balanced or PARC, you were given this spring, the students that were taking those assessments, their scores didn't count in your accountability system. You were able to use last year's data. And so this is a side note here on how the data related to assessment isn't going to provide a very strong picture of how students are doing until we get through this transition to the new college and career ready standards and assessments and these Common Core assessments that have been developed. Okay, I'm going to move quickly through just a couple of things. I'm going to go through this one by one on what the specific differences are between the ESEA statute and the waivers, but just know that it's here in the slide deck if you want to come back and review it. And you can always email any of us with questions. But these are the changes, and I'm just going to flip through here. Current law requires the adoption of state standards, and then under the waivers, it's these college career ready standards in reading and math. I want to focus the rest of our time, the bulk of the time that I have left. One of the changes between the current law and the waiver that's operating under is that they allowed states to set up it's in the second bullet here under waivers, school performance targets, and they can design their own systems now. Third bullet, they can set up what are called these big super subgroups to groups of students together for accountability purposes to kind of look at how they're doing for minority students, for students with disabilities. Overall, what does it look like? But recently, because we don't have at least years under our belt with these waivers, there's some data that can be examined. And so just last week, some civil rights groups and some disability groups got together, wrote Secretary Duncan a letter, told him that the subgroup issue and also the data being used for high school graduation reporting is masking the performance of students in the implement and accountability are working together under the waivers. And basically asked Secretary Duncan, as they consider the components of what will be part of these renewal packages for the waivers next year, that they need to be more rigorous, and that right now we don't really know how students are doing in many of our schools who are poverty, who are minority, have students with a disability or English language learners, that it's very invisible and they're lost in the data. It's a challenge here because one of the big trade-offs is that when they didn't have to focus on all of the schools any longer, they required to look at the bottom 15% of what are called focus and priority schools in the state. And students with disabilities actually exist in all of our schools, and many of those groups of students might be challenged to be meeting state standards. And so our the disability community is that we just don't know enough about what's really going on with the groups of students in the way the data is being reported. And it's something we should all keep our eye on moving forward. I'll get this on teachers and principals, but just know there's some give and take there on that front, and also with how low-performing schools have to intervene. As I mentioned, now under the waivers, they have to focus on the bottom 15% of schools. And they're 85% are basically getting a pass unless your local community has decided to pay attention, because the data still has to be reported, but they don't have to put in any targeted intervention to groups of students who aren't doing well. Just a couple of things to mention before we wrap up. I mentioned the Common Core state standards. We thought it might be helpful to just remind everybody where this came from. I mentioned governors realizing that students graduating from their high schools and not eligible to go to their own community colleges without remediation, and that there were major challenges with the state standards. And so both Republican and Democrat governors came together through the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers and developed a process where they brought in experts and allowed public input over a couple of years to develop the Common Core state standards. And while controversial, the standards are rigorous, and they are meant to allow states who adopt those standards to be competitive on an international front. They are meant to align with and compete with what we call PISA, which is an international academic test that some of our students take in the U.S., and we currently are falling behind other countries around the world. So, Common Core state standards, it's not a federal mandate. States were able to decide whether to adopt or not, and I'm sure you're living somewhere where they're having a debate about whether they should continue to move forward or not. It is part of our modern day controversy today, again, about public education. There are consortia funded. They've conducted their field tests, and more can be learned about that. Organizations, and also there will be a webinar just on assessment next month to talk more about that. Points I wanted to make here are just that some of these other things that are on the landscape that connect to and are part of education law, which are many states implementing school choice through vouchers and charters. There's an impact on students with disabilities in those settings. The virtual learning, and many charters operate in a virtual setting, and or students with disabilities being put into a virtual setting through even, an agreed upon IEP. What is the impact there on least restrictive environment and access to FAPE? There's all kinds of pathways now to become a teacher, alternate pathways. What impact of personalized learning? The Gates Foundation, for example, is putting into looking at personalized learning and what that might mean for school districts to really personalize how the student would learn, and we want students with disabilities to be part of that conversation. And this whole conversation around school career with competence-based education, the idea that you don't need to sit in your seat for a time, but that you could show your competency and continue to move forward. So what's happening next? There's this monitoring of ESEA happening right now. There's data being examined. States getting it out on teacher evaluation systems and what that's going to look like. The election next week is going to tell us a lot about whether this law, ESEA, can be reauthorized, and then, of course, DEA would come after that at some point. ESEA has to be done first. There's a strong anti-testing sentiment in the U.S., and some new reports on trying to show and depict that federal requirement isn't necessarily the problem, but it gets all the blame, and that states and districts have implemented far too many tests that have just, too much pressure on teachers and on kids, and what it means for our system overall. So public still wants information, and I think that's one of the things our groups wanted to convey today, is that we think this information is very important. And as an advocate, I think it's very important that we know how our children are doing as compared to the others in the school building. And with that requirement in ESEA, we wouldn't have that information. The difference, as Ron said, between what's high stakes for the student, but what's meant for accountability for the system overall. And we know that there's just this growing gap between students in poverty, students with disabilities, and their peers, and what is the achievement gap going to mean over time, and what can we do about it? Months ago, and someone presented a whole bunch of data, and thought if I could bring one piece of data into this presentation to leave you with as I wrap up today, what would that be? And it's the number one, and the step from me being the mother of a child with dyslexia and dysgraphia, I think, is kind of where the root of why I care about this number. But if you remember anything, remember the number 1, and that we only have one state in the entire country that has more than 50% of its students reading on grade level by grade 4. And I just think that the implications of that over time, knowing that many of the students may have disabilities, and I know a whole other host of numbers that we should know, but to me this is why ESEA matters, is it helps us know or help us know whether kids can read. And I think that's just an important marker in society to be literate. And so I'm going to turn the time over.
Good afternoon. This is Marcy Lipset. I am a parent advocate in Michigan and, frankly, the country. I am also an activist. I believe they both have to go together because I can't assist families at the local level if I'm not working on laws and the rules and the policies at the state and federal level that continue to preclude many children from receiving a free, appropriate public education. As a parent advocate, I believe that there are approximately 6 million students in America right now with disabilities in kindergarten through the age of 21, and that we need these federal laws. We need the ESEA. We need IDEA. If anything, I think we need more at the federal level because right now children in school districts across America, 14,000 plus districts, depending how you count the charters, are really receiving different educations every day, even with these Common Core standards. Some districts are implementing, some are not, some states are implementing, some states are not, and there's an inequity to the education, and especially for students with disabilities. I believe they all deserve to be equally educated. I believe they need to be educated to compete with their peers who don't have a disability across America and, frankly, all over the world. I think that as an advocate every day, and today I was in 2 IEP meetings, that the great challenge continues to be maintaining that in a child's IEP, even more so with the Common Core standards, even more so with this curriculum that has raised the bar, and I believe that bar needs to be raised, but simply because I am finding that teachers are not prepared to provide instruction, and parents don't understand the Common Core. I'm finding that more parents are being told your child cannot earn a diploma because your child cannot meet standards in the Common Core curriculum throughout school years. In fact, I don't believe that's true. I believe that 98% of children can absolutely succeed. I believe that 98% of kids in America can reach grade level, surpass grade level, and that they need individualized instruction, specialized instruction, access to the grade level curriculum, the Common Core curriculum, and they need teachers that are rigorously trained, highly qualified. And right now, I find one of the things that I find so problematic are that many teachers, for students that need specialized instruction in math, in reading, and in all of those various classes throughout elementary, middle school, high school, the teachers are not highly qualified. They are not trained in content, and they're really not trained in evidence-based methodologies to provide the instruction that the students need, which is why we see the achievement gaps where they are, and frankly, the outcomes are not where any of us want them to be. I find that parents don't understand how to access materials for their kids, instructional materials, and the access to instructional materials is critical for students with disabilities to have access to grade level curriculum. If you have a student with a reading disability and that student is in the 9th grade and working on improving reading, but reading comprehension or reading skills are back in the 5th grade, that student needs access to the curriculum through a digital text reader, through digital text. Students with writing disabilities, there's a vast assortment, growing assortment of instructional materials, computer software, tablet apps, online resources. Parents don't necessarily know how to access them. Teachers aren't necessarily trained on how to use them, so they're skittish even raising them in IEP meetings, and students are really losing opportunities to have the access to curriculum that they need to learn and to master and to display that knowledge. As an advocate, I believe my job is not only to protect parents' rights and children's rights, but to empower parents and to educate them, and to fight not for a diploma, but for a meaningful diploma. I'll give you an example in my state where students can earn a D in every high school class and earn a diploma. I set a higher bar than that. I want students, all students, and students with disabilities to earn meaningful diplomas that do prepare them for post-secondary education and for the workforce and for independence and for access to the American dream. I think there are absolutely roadblocks and detours everywhere for parents today. I think we are in very difficult times. Rod said earlier that we are going to celebrate next year, 2015, the 40th anniversary of the IDEA. I think there's cause to celebrate because I don't think the outcomes are where any of us want them to be. The outcomes, frankly, are very poor. Parents are the experts. I think that parents every day that are exhausted, they're expending resources on their own, they're trying to understand how to help their children with different disabilities, and especially with learning disabilities. And they're not equipped unless they're actually not only a trained general ed teacher, but a special education teacher. And the majority of my parents are not. They're parents who love their children, and they might be experts in their children's disposition, but not experts in how to navigate IDEA, ECA. In fact, I often get confusion where people don't realize that they know left behind with simple reauthorization of ESEA. And even with that, they don't recognize that that federal law doesn't really apply to all children unless they're in a building that qualifies under Title I. And so I find that for children with disabilities that they're really at quite a disadvantage, sometimes even in our more economically sound school districts. So I'm here to educate, and I want parents to attend their children's IBT meetings. I want them to understand that the majority of their kids can earn diplomas. They can learn, engage, and master the Common Core standards, grade level standards. I want the people in the school, the IBT meetings, to understand that parents are not experts. I believe teacher preparation programs have not caught up with these Common Core standards. I think national standards are critical to the education of all children. I believe that women are not earning a meaningful diploma, and I'm finding that the idea of personalized learning, in my state it's called a personal curriculum, that has been a way for school districts to really water down curriculum and water down requirements and even remove requirements. So students are given a diploma, yet without even close to the rigor a student without a disability would have, and they are earning a diploma without in a school taking and passing an Algebra 1, or taking and passing 9th grade and 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade English. Or being permitted to earn these diplomas simply because states are moving more towards personalized learning for kids with disabilities, because they really are trying to find ways to sort of skirt the whole idea of having children engaged in more rigorous curriculum. I tell my parents, and I every day, to repeat, and repeat, that children have a right to access and to make progress in grade level curriculum. And the majority of children with IEPs can do that. The majority of children, when you look at these 6 million, and you have about 38% that have a learning disability, and 24% have a speech and language impairment, and 10% have another health impairment. The majority of children with IEPs can make progress and exceed grade level curriculum and want to be prepared for post-secondary education. I think that parents have to, frankly, set a higher bar for their school districts. I think that they have to avail themselves of resources. You know, I'm a parent leader of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. There are wonderful, wonderful resources like that that offer information so that parents can understand what instructional materials are out there, what is available to students, and not only in school, but for use at home, and understanding what exists in the way of evidence-based instruction in reading, whether it has a reading disability in reading dyslexia or actually in comprehension or written expression or math calculation or problem solving, that parents understand that children have a right to evidence-based instruction and a right to evidence-based instruction while they have access to grade level curriculum. So not to try to repeat myself too often, but going back to the reading, if a student is in ninth grade and still building reading skills, that student still has a right to ninth grade language arts and the Common Core curriculum with digital text, with a text reader, with a Bookshare account, and with all of the instructional materials that are available. The 5th and 6th year high school option that so many parents are unaware of. I go into districts and teachers are unaware that the U.S. Department of Education has given school districts across America permission for all students to be 5th year seniors and students with IEPs to be 6th year seniors. And while I appreciate that children graduate with their peers in 4 years, frankly, I think many would benefit from a 5th year, but for children that need the extra 5th and 6th years so they are really prepared and leave their high school with a truly meaningful diploma and can go on to post-secondary successfully, that 5th and 6th year is important for parents to understand is out there and available. That right now, the 6 million children are not receiving a free appropriate public education. I know that there are many districts that are cash-strapped, teachers are not yet trained, and frankly, our kids are suffering, and the flaws are there. They need to be accessed. Frankly, they need to be recognized, and I think they need to be held accountable. And to do, parents have to understand as much as they can about ESEA and about IDEA and touching on Section 504 and 504 plans, understanding the federal laws that guide and govern your child's education, because that is the minimum floor, and that is required across the country. And the goal for a child should be a really meaningful diploma that takes a child to that next step, whatever that is, if it's 4-year college, 2-year university or college, career and technical training program, whatever that child's post-secondary step is, it needs to be done with a very solid diploma and reading and writing and math levels that are proficiency level to prepare the kids. I think we'll turn it back to Katie.
Thank you, Marcy. I really appreciate it. We've got a couple. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. Got a couple of questions. The first one is about the statistic that 90% of students with disabilities can reach grade level academic achievement. Can I ask Laura or Ron to address that? I think it's a need that we spent a lot of time talking about. So maybe, Laura, would you mind answering that question?
Sure. So the National Center for Educational Outcomes, who is funded by the U.S. Department of Education, tracks these data. And through state-reported data and how students with disabilities are classified and reported to the Department of Education, the data show that it's about 87%, and Marcy's rounded up to 90%, that students do not have intellectual disabilities. And so Marcy mentioned a couple of categories of students with learning disabilities, students with speech impairment, other health impaired. It's when you start looking at how those groups of students that we know by their eligibility and the way they're classified do not have intellectual disabilities, that we absolutely should be expecting those students to be working at grade level. And we have that same expectation and wanting to align for students with intellectual disabilities that the material can be aligned to grade level standard for them. We're learning so much more about what students can learn and achieve.
Perfect. Ron, I have a question for you, and that is, what rights do parents have to ensure their children can access the general curriculum?
Thanks, Katie. And really, as I showed in the earlier slide, every single piece of the development of the IEP is to be focused on accessing the general curriculum. When we start right from the beginning of developing present levels of performance, with the student currently performing when compared to the general curriculum. And then we develop the goals for the student, we develop the services for the students. They're all to be looking at access to the general curriculum. And so basically, using this rough statistic around 90%, basically 90% of the students with disabilities should be expected to access and make progress in the general curriculum. The 1% carve-out comes for the alternative assessment. The school districts under NCLB were only allowed to exempt 1% of their students from the academic content evaluations. So really that's the default. If school is going to be saying they shouldn't be accessing the curriculum, the burden's on them. How and why. As Marcy said, even if the current level of reading, for example, is high enough to be able to understand the content of a ninth grade course through alternative ways of presenting the material, including using assistive technology, they will be able to access the content. Even if they can't read it, they can still be able to access it. I hope that gives you some ideas.
We've got a follow-up question that one of you could answer. It's, what a student with an intellectual disability who struggles with multiplication facts be in an algebra class? Is it frustrating for both the student and the teacher?
This is Marcy. Can I jump in on this one?
Sure.
Okay. You know, this is a complicated question. One, intellectual disability is broad, and I think we need to be careful with it. We always appreciate, again, and I referenced the 5th and 6th year of high school, is that students with IEPs don't have to take high school curriculum in sequence. If a student enters the 9th grade with an intellectual disability and what we would call a mild cognitive impairment, and enters the 9th grade with a level or math skills that are splintered across the 4th, the 5th, maybe the 6th grade, the student doesn't have to start typical 9th grade curriculum in the 9th grade. It can be pushed back, and students can continue to receive specialized instruction through a class for students with learning disabilities, or in Michigan we call them resource rooms. So I think, again, that the majority of children, even with cognitive impairments, can master Algebra 1. I think, one, that they need teachers who are trained in math and who are trained in content areas, and I find often that is not the case in special education classrooms and resource rooms, as we call them in Michigan, that a teacher staffing a special education algebra class in the 9th grade is not, doesn't have an endorsement in high school mathematics, and really doesn't have the level of knowledge, and I think it does make teachers uncomfortable. I know it makes it very difficult for the kids, and frankly perpetuates a misconception that kids can't learn Algebra 1. We're not talking Algebra 2. That would be a different discussion. But I do believe that the majority of children can learn Algebra 1 and can reach much higher levels if they receive instruction from teachers that have had the rigorous training and with instructional materials and with the specialized evidence-based instruction right now we're just setting up, frankly, a lot of students and a lot of teachers because the teachers don't have the training. Their class sizes are ever growing and just too much pressure, and kids are not reaching those levels, frankly, because they haven't had early enough access to instruction. And then once they hit high school, we sort of say, you're done learning to read. I, as an advocate, I have to fight every week. I am fighting for kids who are in high school who need explicit reading instruction. They are not done learning to read. They should be able to continue to learn to read and to build their math proficiency and writing skills, even though they're in high school. They reach much higher levels.
Sarah, I'd like to jump in too and just refer to some research that can be pulled up on the internet, and we can send the link out. I just didn't have a chance to do it right here, but several places are working with kids with all kinds of disabilities across the spectrum of intellectual disability. And as Marcy said, it is a very broad term, but we're learning so much more about what the capacity is for different learners in the way that they learn and how they can express their knowledge. And so Jackie Kearns, Kearns, is one of the lead researchers in this area, as is Sandra Warren and others. But there's just work ongoing that is phenomenal, and there's video and all kinds of documentation of what we're learning about these students, and the higher that we set the bar, the willingness of the student when they are surrounded by people who are trained and getting the accommodations and the adaptations that they need and the support through technology also, it's really inspiring what's happening.
Jump in as well. There's a difference between what is algebra and the question specifically about math facts. There are students with disabilities that will probably never be able to use the arithmetic, subtraction, multiplication, division, but are capable of relatively sophisticated math. So what is being taught in algebra? What is the expectation? It's really not multiplication tables. So there you can give an accommodation, not in the assessment, but also in the instruction, to let that person have assistive technology to do the basic calculations, but still the understanding of what is going on in algebra.
Yeah. We have a comment along these lines, and I think this is a really important topic and one that has a lot of different opinions about it. One of the things that I think a number of us have a lot of experience with in working with particular kids in particular schools is this whole notion of teaching, of having a special education teacher work with the content education teacher, and math is a really good example of how to modify a curriculum that a student can really understand, can grasp the content, the concepts that are being presented. Comment about putting a student in a position to fail and destroy their self-esteem should not be the goal of any advocate or educator. No one on this call is advancing that as a notion. What we are advancing is that kids with the right kind of instruction can be very successful, but how do you get that right kind of instruction for every kid? So one of the questions I would put to the group is, how do I know if my child's teacher or teachers have the knowledge and skill to educate my child? And Louis, I'd ask you to comment on that.
States determine what their certification standards are for all teachers, and there was a requirement in ESEA, in No Child Left Behind, that I did require that if your teacher was not certified in reading and math, in those two core subjects, that you as a parent were to get a letter at the beginning of the school year to let you know that your child would be in a classroom with a teacher who was not certified to be teaching at least those two one or both of those two subjects, and in the path that the teacher was on to sufficiently meet the state requirements. Federal law, a little tweak has been made to federal law where that requirement no longer exists because of a push from some that were really proponents of alternate teachers, alternate certification paths, and teachers that come in with some summer training and come to the classroom in the fall, become the teacher of record. And so there's been this debate in the last several years now about what to do, but I think it really is now on the parent to ask.
Okay. And one of the other questions we have is, why is it important to have a subgroup for students with disabilities?
Well, and this is what, okay, I think, or Laura also alluded to this, Katie. The districts were kind of getting a pass on the progress that students with disabilities were making. And many times, at IEP meetings, the parents would be told, oh, your child's doing really well, we're going to have a great year last year, have a great year next year, we're just going to keep goals going forward. But there was never an objective measure of how that student was doing. And so by requiring, first of all, that the students be assessed with, academic, measures that are the same as everyone else, to get an objective measure on how that student's performing. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Will you have that question?
Important, or is it important to have a subgroup specifically for students with disabilities?
Yes. Yeah, so that's on the individual level. That individual parent can benefit from knowing how they're trying on these assessments. In the same way, at school level, as a school, we get a sense of how the students with disabilities are faring in that school. And as Laura said, the data, that information is critical. So they have the individual benefit, but also the group level. We can look in the state education department, which oversees implementation of IDEA, even though these are ESEA requirements, it helps us with IDEA compliance. If a school district has all of their students, a significant percentage of their students who are near grade level, the school district in a school building that needs to be looked at, not just for ESEA compliance, but also for IDEA compliance. So in that subgroup ability is critical to looking at where there might be problems where interventions need to be taking place, not just under NLB/ESEA. We're using the two terms kind of interchangeably now. The idea of both, it's critical for IDEA as well.
Just to add to that, one of the things that's been really very impactful of having this data is that we've been able to show that kids with disabilities achieve at on a similar bell curve all other students. You have just as many students with disabilities at the high end as you would at the low end in a proportionate way to the rest of the general population. And the thing is, it has allowed, is required sort of building principles to the academic progress of all the kids in their building, because they're going to be measured on that. So it makes it harder for kids to fall through the cracks. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it at least have a tool that allows parents to go in and say to a school, you'll be doing great for 80% of the kids that go here, but for the 20% of kids who have a disability or come from a low-income family or whatever, you're not meeting their needs, is a way to help improve the quality of education for all kids when all kids in that school have the attention of the adults in the building. I had a question about where the slides for this webinar will be, and they will be posted and the recording at www.higherexpectationsforall.org. So we hope that you guys can take a look at this information and share it with your colleagues. I have a couple more questions. One is the Common Core standards set by the federal government. And Laura, would you mind, I know you addressed that in your panel, but I think it's an important one for people to hear the answer. I need to unmute your
There, I'm sorry, I had a little glitch. Sorry, there is no. The federal government has not been involved in the development of the Common Core state standards, nor did they mandate that states adopt them. What has occurred, as I mentioned, and I'll pull this apart a little bit more, is the requirement under the waivers for states to adopt college and career-ready standards. And the Obama administration did say that the Common Core state standards could qualify because of the way they were developed to be rigorously matched against those international benchmarks that I talked about. And they've also been basically verified by enough experts in math that they meet the sufficient standards. If they don't want to adopt the Common Core, they can develop their own standards, but they need to be verified by their higher ed system, within the state, to say the reading and math standards meet the veracity of what we think is the expectation of any graduating student from our high schools to come into our university or college setting.
Okay. We have another question, and this could be for either Ron or for Marcy. The question is, under IDEA, can a student who misses school for medical appointments or medical emergencies be counted as absence for the purpose of the 10-day period that would allow a child to be suspended from school?
Okay. If a child is absent for medical and there is a doctor's note, and I always encourage my families, I have children with very, very complex medical needs. I always encourage parents to have a note from the doctor. That's an excused absence. And every once in a while I'll run into a district that has some goofy policy on attendance, and even when there is a doctor's note, I typically work through that with the special ed administrator. But a doctor's note should do the, and a child with a doctor's note, that shouldn't go against any number of days that would result in any kind of disciplinary or suspension. Does that question?
Yep, super. And then,
follow up on this just for a second. Another thing that happens is school districts have a minimum number of attendance days to get credit. That if you're miss X, if you have to be present for 80% of the classes or 90% of the classes, or you're going to be not able to get credit for that class. Under 504, there's been a very good argument can be made that if the reason the student's missing is because of their disability, the school district would have to modify that attendance policy to excuse absences for attendance policy, which would go into the 504 plan. Not quite the same as the question, but it's a kind of a core issue that comes up.
Perfect. We have another question, and is this webinar series eligible for continuing legal education credit? And the folks at COPA said they can provide a certificate of attendance that you can present to your bar, but we have not arranged in advance for a CLE. I have another question. Sharon and the rest of the IEP team determine how the rest of a child. Why do we need assessment?
This is Marcy. I'll take a crack at that. We need multiple data points for kids. Again, as an advocate and for my own child, I found that very often, especially when you're looking at writing, that it's subjective. I have 100 teachers, and they will look at a student's writing sample and grade it differently because it is so subjective. I think that as long as the assessment is formatted and designed to allow the child to display his or her knowledge, that does garner important information. This problem I find is that whether it's a test that is simply a test designed by a teacher or a district or common assessment or even a state assessment or these new national, the PARCC and Smarter Balanced, that they're not yet to allow children to display their knowledge.
Great. We've referenced Park and Smart Balanced a couple times on this call. Could you give people just a quick description of what those entities are?
Yes, there's a thumbnail, and then, of course, the assessment webinar will go into more details. When the requirement came forward through the waivers and through Race to the Top money that many of the states, the federal government, some competitive grants that went to states to help improve their standard setting and to improve student achievement, the government decided that one thing they needed to do was invest in a common assessment, because one of the problems with No Child Left Behind, even though we had all this new data, none of it's comparable from state to state, because every state, of course, their own standards and their own proficiency targets and determine who is proficient, and we can't compare any one state to another to see how fourth graders are doing in Kentucky as opposed to next door in Ohio. So it's invested $500 million in the last 4 years, and came forward. And these are a consortia of states, and so states are together deciding what their state test is going to look like. And Smarter Balanced is one of the consortia, and they have, I think they have over 20 states in their consortia, and Park has just under 20. And so really 20 states in each of those will have reading and math assessment, including formative assessments, those tests that students take during the school year to see how they're doing with the curriculum and to help teachers assess their teaching instruction for students. All of this is coming online in the spring of 2015, and so we've been through a process in the country to get students tested, to do the field testing, and to kind of make these tests both computerized, and so students will be in line. There will be a paper and pencil option for the next couple of years for states that aren't quite ready to have every student taking tests on the computer. But it is very exciting. And for students with disabilities, I'll just say this one last thing, since you get the floor, probably taking longer than you wanted. But students with disabilities, one of the things the disability community has really worked with both Park and Smarter Balance on is to assure that the technology is as high-tech as it can be, that it's adaptable to students' assistive technology. The students are going to have access to the testing accommodations that they need. Many of them are built in. For instance, blind students won't have to wait for hours and hours to get their refreshable Braille. There's the effort in both Park and Smarter Balance to make Braille accessible in the moment. And so the student doesn't have to wait to take their test. They get to take their test with everybody else. And that's just one example of some of the effort on Park and Smarter Balance. And there have been problems along the way. I don't mean to make it sound like it's been smooth, but the opportunity here for our students with disabilities to be fully participating in the general assessment with their peers is probably the best it's ever been.
Sue, thank you. If folks would like a certificate of attendance for this webinar, please send an email to the following email address and we'll send you one. The email address is exec@copaa.org. That's exec@copa.org. We have time for just a couple more questions. Are there more questions that folks would like to ask?
Can I jump in for a second? It's Marcy.
Of course.
I'll apologize if anyone hears my dogs in the background. I want to be really clear before we hang up that I never, as an advocate, allow a child to be a frustrational learning environment. Not in reading, not in writing, not in mathematics. That's never good for a child. Children should never be at a frustration level. They should be at an instructional level. Point, whether and everybody loves to focus on Algebra 1. I always focus on how, where can I get a child in reading, writing, and math? I mean, how high can they go? But have more years to learn and more time, and I think that's the only point I want people to remember, that kids don't have to take Algebra 1 in the 9th grade, or in some districts even in the 8th grade. They can take it later, and many of them are ready to take it later. Many of them would be ready to take it in the 9th grade if they had the earlier instruction. But I don't want anyone to think that anybody that is presented today believes that children should be in a frustrating or at a frustrational level of learning. That is never, ever good for a child. Not for the child's mental health or child's self-esteem.
Thank you for that. Ron, do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share?
The biggest thing is individualization, that each student is different, and that unfortunately all too often the school districts use the same method for everybody, have the same program for everybody, and you really have to make sure that your child, especially if you're a parent or if you're an advocate, the child you're working with, is getting the individualized instruction they need, including the methodology of teaching. For so long, we've heard school districts say that that's our job to determine methodology, but the law is extremely clear that in the IEP meeting, you can discuss methodology, especially if the student is learning based on this, the normal curriculum is for, or the instructional method is for the student, that you have to match the way you're teaching to the individual learning style of the student. That's a critical piece.
Thanks. And what about you? Any last thoughts?
I'd just like to encourage every parent and parent advocate that participates in this webinar to really help us understand the challenges that you're facing where you are, and find a way to communicate with us through the various organizations that are participating in the webinars. We need to hear in DC what's happening at home. It helps us do our work. I hope we're all unified in a commitment to making sure that feds are aligned in ways that fully support students with disabilities, and understand that Congress does have an impact both through funding and these policy changes that are coming, and we need to be working together to make really good things happen.
Thank you. And thanks everyone who participated in the call today. I just want to echo what my colleagues have said. What our intentions are is to work with you to ensure that every child with a disability gets the best possible education that will allow them to have the most choice as independent adults for their futures. We know that there is a lot of work in front of us to support teachers to have the skill and knowledge to deliver the content so kids can master it, to make sure kids have the other supports and resources that they need to be successful. And I hope that you will join us for the next two webinars on November 20th and December 11th. The slides that you were part of today's presentation can be found at the website www.higherexpectationsforall.org, and we look forward to working with you and hearing from you in the next weeks and months. Thank you everyone for your attention, and we can sign off the webinar now.